Good evening. Good evening. Welcome, everyone, to IKG's Wisdom Wednesday. I am your host, Sister Ajwa, and we are so glad that you are able to join us this evening for another, what will sure to be a great presentation. Before we get started, I would like to just give you all a few reminders about tonight's presentation. This is a Zoom webinar, which means that your cameras are automatically off and your audio is off. If you would like to engage with us, which we encourage you to do, we ask that you utilize the chat box to share any thoughts as we're going through the program. Also, any questions specifically for our panelists during our Q&A session, we are asking that you place those in the Q&A box specifically. And as we always do, we want to acknowledge our family who are checking in from around the world. So we do ask that in the chat, you go ahead and let us know where you're checking in from so we can shout you out. So we want to say greetings to our family in Maryland, DC. We have Atlanta in the house, Fairburn, Georgia. Welcome, welcome. Of course, PG County, Lawrenceville, Georgia. We have Brooklyn by way of Haiti in the house. Okay, Indiana's in the house. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. California's in the house. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We have our friends from across the pond from Leeds, England in the house. Thank you. Thank you. Chicago is in the house. Virginia Beach is in the house. Wonderful. And as others are joining, please, of course, welcome the fam as they come on in. I want to first start off with tonight. Tonight's a very special day. As you all know, we are IKG Cultural Resource Center, home of Wisdom Wednesday, home of the Egypt on the Potomac field trips, home of the tours to Egypt that a large group just got back from on yesterday. We are the home of the ASA Restoration Project. IKG was founded by Anthony Browder. Please join me in wishing our Nana Karak, our Jegna, a wonderful, wonderful happy birthday. Thank you, Baba Tony, for your continued work, for your dedication, your commitment, for your knowledge, your courageous spirit. May the ancestors continue to bless you and lift you up. May God continue to protect you and provide you with all that you need to continue to be the blessing that you are to not only yourself and your family and community, but the world at large. So please join me in welcoming and giving Tony a wonderful birthday greeting. And I want to also just let you all know that throughout tonight's program, I'm going to be placing a couple of websites in the chat. We want to encourage you all to support our Wisdom Wednesday speakers, not only our current speaker, but those that we've had in the past. So we've had Brother Eze Okoye come to speak, and he'll be having a workshop coming up in a few days on July 29th on awaken your senses to restore your true heart space. And in this program, you will learn to expand your portals of perception through Qigong movements, essential oils, and breath work to restore your energetic heart space and cultivate harmony and flow through these shifting times. I will be placing a website for you to get more information and purchase tickets for his program shortly in the chat. I want to also invite you to a program by former Wisdom Wednesday speaker Mbwebe Nshage, and he'll be having a crypto work master course affiliate program. So I will share more about, well, you can learn more about his crypto woke program. I'll be placing that information also in the chat box for you all. And now we're going to move on to tonight's program. And tonight we are very pleased to be welcoming two wonderful women who will be speaking on autism in the Black community. Our presenters tonight are Doctors Melissa Duchene Kelly, PhD, and Dr. Abila Tazanu, MD. Dr. Duchene Kelly's presentation will be specifically on unsung heroes, the voices of mothers raising children with autism spectrum disorder. She writes, for children with disabilities, parents play a pivotal role in the quality of life of these youngsters as they attempt to appropriately respond to the unique challenges inherent in rearing their children. Specifically, the behavioral characteristics of children with autism spectrum disorder may influence parents' behavior, particularly within the parent-child interaction. Other factors, such as the stress and depression that parents and the social support, such as the stress and depression that parents may experience through caring for a child with autism spectrum disorder, and the social support parents receive may interact to influence the quality of the parent-child relationship. This presentation will shed light on mother-child interactions in Black families with children with autism and mothers' well-being as it relates to stress and depression. And our second presenter, Dr. Abila Tazanu, will have a candid look at autism and families of color from a mother and pediatrician's perspective. In her presentation, she shares that it will be a dialogue about autism spectrum disorder and its impact on the family. She will share observations and information on the identification of children, youth, parental acceptance, the importance of vision and acquiring services and supports that fulfill vision. She says we will explore some of the challenges and opportunities that communities of color have on their journey with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. And now a little bit about our presenters. Dr. Duchene Kelly is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Bowie State University. Her research focuses on parent experiences raising children with autism spectrum disorder from underrepresented communities. Of particular interest were parenting behaviors, parent-child interactions, and how the specific characteristics of children with ASD affect parenting practices. Dr. Abila Tazanu is a pediatrician with greater than 20 years of health and community service provision. She received her BS in microbiology and her doctorate of medicine from Howard University in Washington, D.C. She currently serves as Spectrum of Hope's lead medical guide consultant, where she pursues her passion for enhancing the lives of those living with ASD and related different abilities while enriching the communities in which we live. So I'm going to ask Dr. Duchene Kelly, who will be our first presenter, and to come on screen. Welcome.
Hi.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you, and the floor is yours. After Dr. Duchene Kelly speaks, we will then hear from Dr. Tazanu, and after both presentations, we will then be able to participate in the Q&A. So audience, I do ask that as you're typing and getting your questions, please note who they're for and to hold all of your questions to the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajwa, for having me here today. I'm really excited about sharing my knowledge about parenting children who are on the autism spectrum, particularly those who come from minority households. So let's get started, family. So the title of my talk today is Unsung Heroes, the Voices of Black Mothers Raising Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder. Excuse me, let's try this again. It's not advancing. Perfect. One thing that actually led me led me to this topic, led me to this career path is that in graduate school, I knew I wanted to work with families that had children on the spectrum. I didn't know what necessary capacity, but the more I interacted with mothers, particularly Black mothers, I found that their voices tend to be muted. And I am here as a researcher to lend my voice so that the community can hear their voices a bit louder. So just a bit of background, a bit of statistics about autism spectrum disorder. It's a neurological disorder and a developmental disorder. So that means that it's areas of the brain or regions of the brain are infected by the disorder. And also it's developmental disorder because it can be diagnosed at any point in an individual's life, but typically the symptoms occur within the first 2 years of a child's life. It impairs how people interact with others. It impairs their communication, their learning, and their behavior. And there's no type of blood or biologic test that can be done in order for one to determine if a child is going to be on the autism spectrum at birth. It's diagnosed by making judgments about a child's behavior. In terms of the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder, it's rising at an exponential rate, and it's one of the fastest growing developmental disabilities out there. 1% of the entire world's population has ASD, which when you think about it, it calculates to over 75 million people worldwide who are on the autism spectrum. Here in the US, it affects about 1 in every 36 children, and boys are more likely to be diagnosed with the disorder than girls. And just in terms of the research, it's likely that there's some research that suggests that girls have this XX chromosome and that extra, whereas boys have the XY chromosome, and it's the extra X chromosome that might serve as some type of protector or barrier for girls. And that's why they may be diagnosed less, or the prevalence rate for girls being on the autism spectrum is less than boys. There is some recent research that came out from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that shows that autism is diagnosed more frequently now in Black and Hispanic children than white kids. So for about 3% of Black and Hispanic children, they're being diagnosed compared to about 2% of white kids. And the reason why, well, it's attributed to improved screening for children when it comes to autism overall. However, the research is still clear that white children still are receiving more access to autism services than Black children. So there are some health disparities and inequities that continue to exist. Just some background on the well-being of parents of children who have autism, parents of children who are on the autism spectrum or who have autism. These parents tend to show elevated levels of stress and are at increased risk of depression. These challenges that are inherent in raising children who are on the spectrum that may affect the ways in which parents actually perceive their children and may affect the ways in which parents actually parent their children. There's research that shows that mothers of children with autism report lower parenting competencies than mothers of children without disability. So when we are to ask a mother who has a child on autism, do you feel confident in your parenting abilities? Oftentimes, these mothers tend to report lower levels of confidence and competence. But there are some benefits to parenting a child who's on the spectrum. For example, there can be some improvements in relationships, marital relationships, that is. There can be increased patience in the parent, and there can be an increase or enhanced spiritual growth. So parents who tend to have children on the spectrum oftentimes will report that they now have more of a spiritual connection. In terms of the actual parenting behaviors that are exhibited by parents who are raising children on the spectrum, there's some positive parenting practices that we can see. For example, warm and sensitive parents who use positive praise tend to have children who have less behavioral issues. In terms of negative parenting practices, those parents who are intrusive, sometimes you hear about helicopter moms who are often hovering over their children and inserting themselves without the child asking for assistance. These children tend to be less advanced in their communication skills. And these lack of communication skills tend to linger on, so that they are longitudinal, and we see them over an extended period of time, not just in childhood. Also, for parenting routines, one hallmark of autism is that sometimes these children love to be on a specific routine or have specific routines or be on a specific schedule. And the research shows that lower levels of routine sometimes is associated with more externalizing behaviors from children. So these children tend to exhibit more aggressive behavior or hyperactivity when they're taken off of their routines. And this is generally speaking, this is not for all children who are on the spectrum. So I wanted to share with you all this study that I did where I interviewed parents, mothers specifically, who had children, preschool-age children who are on the spectrum. And I also did observations with the parents to look at their parent-child interactions. I would go with the families on running their errands. So I'd go to Target, Walmart. I would go with the children to the mall with their parents. I'd have lunch with them at a restaurant, just to kind of get more of a sense of what is it like, what the experiences are for mothers raising children who are on the spectrum. These were the mothers that participated in the study. There were 6. These names are pseudonyms, so these are not the actual names of the moms, but everything else is represents the moms. So you can see the age, they were between 30 and 40. Majority of them were married, employment varied, and 3 of them were African American. I'm going to focus on the responses and the observations from the African American families. And here you can see some of the descriptions of the children. They varied across the diagnosis here. They ranged in age from 2 to 4 years, and their language ranged. Some were verbal, some were slightly nonverbal, but they were all, as you can see here, they were all males. So based off of my interviewing the families, and these were hours of interviews and hours of observations, looking at the mother-child interactions, I was able to come up with certain themes that I would see. So one theme is positivity within the mother-child relationship. Through my observation, for one mom, while in the middle of working on the child, while in the middle of working on his letters, Bobby stopped and placed his head on his mother's shoulder in such a gentle way. He then patted her back in a soft manner. So this observation, this interaction between the mother and child shows that there are positive moments between the mother and the child. It's not necessarily always stress and depression. In terms of the schedules and routines, one mom said in her interview, every day is different. I purposefully don't keep him on a routine. That's one of my methods of dealing with autism. I do things differently every day to keep him adjusted to having to deal with different situations. So in this mom's specific case, she opted not to keep her child on a very strict routine because she said that the world, and just by nature of being in the world, it's not always going to be the same thing over and over and over again. So she wanted her child to be able to be fluid and to be able to adjust to varying schedules. Now, one thing that came up is certain strategies that mothers may use in order to get their children to cooperate. If any of you have children, then you know that it is difficult. They do not always respond the way you want them to respond. They do not always respond appropriately in different settings. So for this mom, an observation, I'm watching this occur. Alex wanted to ride a motorized helicopter at the mall. When the ride finished, it was time to leave the mall. Alex began crying hysterically. Fatima carried him out and withheld giving him his iPad when they arrived at the car. So that's just one way that this mother used, one method that she used to kind of calm her son down and to establish rules for him. So when he calmed himself down in the car, then she proceeded to give him his iPad. Still staying along the lines of some challenging behaviors and mothers' responses, in an interview, I asked Brianna, tell me about some challenges behavior and how would you normally respond? So she gave me an example and she said, he used to bang, well, when they were going on walks, he used to bang his head on the concrete sidewalk outside. I hugged him and told him I loved him. I'm restraining him with force, but try to do it in a loving, nurturing way. So in this particular situation, obviously, if a child is banging his head on the concrete, that's dangerous. So mom, instead of yanking him or pulling him, she decided to show some type of more affection with it while restraining him. Now here is a mother telling me about what she believes is behind the child exhibiting challenging behaviors. So for Erica, she says, or said, I second guess myself because I don't know. A classic example is that he doesn't want to take medicine even though he's in pain. Is that because he's on the autism spectrum? Or is it because I have a kid who is just 5 years old? I don't know. Every time there's something that I don't understand why he's doing it, it might not have anything to do with being on the autism spectrum, but I don't know what is or what isn't. And for this mom, Erica, she didn't have any other children. She was this was her only child. So she couldn't even compare her child's behavior with another child in the household. And this question, I asked the mom about the future of her child and what she hopes. And her response was, I cried because how is this going to affect him growing up? What happens if I pass away? Will he be able to function? How is this going to affect him in the long run? And I remember this mom started crying during the interview because it really was a source of stress for her because she constantly worried. Right now, her child is between 2 and 4, so preschool age, but what's going to happen when my child is an adult and I'm no longer here to care for him? Now, with this question, I asked about what typically happens when the mom goes out in public with her child, a normal thing that oftentimes we who do not have children on the spectrum might not realize how significant this can be, going out with your child. So she said, everyone is staring at you and thinks that you're not disciplining your child or that he's a spoiled brat because people don't know it's autism. and they don't physically see anything wrong with him. They just assume that it's the parent and that I need to learn how to discipline him. And I don't know about you all, but when I go to the grocery store, Target, Walmart, I see children who, in our view, would be classified as misbehaving. But I never place a label on it, being in my field and the research that I focus on, because I don't know that child. I don't know their background. And I implore you all that you do the same. If you ever see a child throwing a tantrum in the store, you don't know that child's background. So offer a hand to assist instead of criticizing, if that ever occurs. Now with this mom, this topic was about stress. And she said, you're constantly fighting the insurance company and the school system for services. There's no money. If I didn't have to deal with this, I'd probably be more fun and loving. Having financial stress is really devastating. I'm not paying my mortgage for applied behavior analysis. Now, applied behavior analysis is a type of therapy that can be used with children who are on the spectrum, or children who are not on the spectrum. It's just a type of therapy to help behavior, modify behavior. But for this mom, it was extremely expensive for her because she had to pay out of pocket. The insurance wouldn't cover this type of therapy. And she literally would have to think, do I pay my mortgage this month, or do I pay for my child's therapy? Now, we all have our village, right? So I wanted to ask parents, what is it, or how does your family help, or how do friends help you when it comes to raising your child? So Brianna said, I talk to other families. It makes me feel better being able to hear someone share their story and make me realize that I'm not the only one. Now, this was Brianna's response. Another participant of this study said that, and I'm going to quote, she said that when she talks to some of her family, she oftentimes she's reluctant to, because their response would be, just pray it away, pray the autism away, or that child doesn't have anything wrong with him, he just needs a spanking. And so it was devastating for that parent because she didn't necessarily have much of an outlet. In terms of advocating for your child, one mom says that she is constantly doing research. She's a little research fanatic. I'm always on Google looking things up. My main goal is to find as much resources as I can for him. So this mom is doing what a lot of moms would do, if your child has any type of issue, whether you're a parent who has a child that's on the spectrum or a parent who has typically developing children, you're going to make sure that you advocate for your child. And that requires you finding the appropriate resources. So that's the end of my presentation. I just wanted to give you all a sense of what these mothers are experiencing in their daily lives, and to lend my voice as a researcher to make their voices louder. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tazanu.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Let me attempt to share my screen so I can get into presentation. All right. I'd like to first and foremost thank Adjoa and Dr. Kelly for the invitation to be able to share. And I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of first a mother, and then a pediatrician that cares for children and youth on the autism spectrum and with related developmental differences. And the title of this presentation is called Autism in the Family and the Importance of Becoming a Holistic Parent Advocate. And that centers around vision. So this particular presentation has come from just many years of working with my own children, and then working with families and trying to find resources to best help and guide our journey. And I found that this particular resource of creating vision has to become a part of our narrative in order to shift things for us. So let's begin. So when I initially created this presentation, I had to ask myself, what does it mean to be an advocate? Because when you become a parent, you're actually thrown into the world of advocacy and you don't really even know that. But there's someone outside of yourself that you are willing to go to bat for every day of your life. And so when it comes to children with developmental differences, we're doing that, but we're doing that in a different way. And so a definition of an advocate is one who supports, promotes the interest of another, a cause, or a group. But I want to take it a step further, because I think when in the process of us advocating, whether it be for our children, for a cause, there's a certain level of self-care and mindfulness of self that has to occur. And this is where the holistic piece of things come in. So when we think about what does it mean to be holistic, it means that we're thinking about the whole and not just ourselves as parts. So the whole is more than sum of parts. And we're looking at the person, the individual, whether it be our child, ourselves, our family, in a complete sense. So physically and psychologically. So when we look at all these different components that lead to holistic well-being, there's of course our physical, how we're socially connected to others, our emotional well-being, and for many of us, our spiritual well-being. So when we put that all together, the definition of a holistic parent advocate that I will use, and which will be kind of the compass for this presentation, is a parent who supports or promotes the consistent and positive physical, emotional, social, and spiritual well-being of themselves, yes, themselves, their family unit, and then that of their children. And I will say it's been hard for me to actually get to this point because, as mothers, as caregivers, we're often really taught and conditioned to put others before ourselves. But, over my lifetime, I've learned that there has to be a caring of self first in order to be able to give to those that we really love. So the importance of family support. I will say that over my years of practicing, we go into medicine and you're very conditioned, kind of trained and looking at the condition and how it affects parts of the body. But we often tend to kind of put those that are supporting the individual off to the side. But when it comes to children, we really cannot make that divide. Supporting the family is huge. The family is the foundation for every child's success. And as a community of color, we really must have this holistic way of thinking and to be able to empower those in our community to become holistic parent advocates. So I want to be able to share my thoughts on how we can do that. Dr. Duchene Kelly shared some of the characteristics of children and youth with autism. So I'm not going to repeat that, but what I will say is that the traits and the characteristics of individuals on the autism spectrum can really place them at risk for isolation, okay? Isolation can come from many different things, a lack of understanding, just, cultural, the way we were raised culturally. So there's so many things, but often individuals who have autism and family members who are supporting them find themselves isolated. And that can present a lot of challenges for families. And Dr. Duchene Kelly really shared so nicely some of the views of parents. And as she was sharing, I was shaking my head when it came to my own story. So I'd like to share a little bit about me. I know Adjua read my bio, but I really have my life and my purpose has really been shaped by this journey with autism. I have been blessed with 5 children, all of whom are adults, and 3 of my children have autism. And they were kind of diagnosed not according to their chronological age, but really according to how they presented. So the first child that was diagnosed was my daughter, Saida, and she was diagnosed right, around the age of 3, but I had been noticing challenges or differences, I wouldn't say challenges, differences in her development. She started developing, she was moving really, really fast. And then all of a sudden there was a really stark regression. And at that time I had just completed residency. I started sharing some of these concerns with my own primary care provider, who was a woman of color, and I loved her dearly. But what I got was a lot of reassurance. And I had just had another baby. So I was told that, you know, this child is going to catch up. Don't you worry. Everything is going to be okay. And so I started dismissing the voice within me until the baby that was born after her, my fourth child and third son, started doing things and progressing at a faster rate. And then I said, no, I really have to explore this a little bit more. While she was being evaluated, I was pregnant with my last child. And so my antennas were up. I got the diagnosis in her. And then I started noticing some things in him when he was probably a little before a year. So he, unlike his sister, was not progressing in terms of communication, started engaging in behaviors that were repetitive, twirling leaves, always a very happy baby, very quiet and pleasant baby, but there were definitely things that were very different. And then my last child was actually living under the radar of his two siblings that were more impacted. So he was always kind of a socially more shy child, but when he got into middle school, I started seeing stark challenges in him, which led to a lot of emotional behavioral health issues. And he actually came into the diagnosis at around 18 years of age. So I just share that story because there's so many ways that children and youth can present. And I think often in our culture, people, and when I say culture, I'm going to refer to those in the African American diaspora, that we can often see a difference in how children come in because of our biases or because of what we heard. But needless to say, all of my children have impacted how I see children now and what my work is. And my struggle to support them, identify their needs, really led to a lot of challenges within my own health, whether that was physical, emotional, and a shift in terms of how I had to see how I was living and functioning as their mother, to wake up to become an advocate for them, as well as those that I was serving. All right, so I'm going to talk about what kind of happens, and I know Melissa shared some of this, but as a community, it really is important for us to understand that the diagnosis of autism can be a very difficult diagnosis for a family to get. In the African diasporic community, a lot of times there's a lot of denial of the condition. As she mentioned before, sometimes we just strictly chalk up everything to just behavior, and that discipline will take it away. My cultural background is West Indian. So my mom is from Trinidad and Tobago, and my dad was West African, so from Cameroon. And even within those two cultures, there was a very different way of looking at developmental differences. On the Caribbean side, it was like, oh, just spank it out of them, they'll be just fine. On the African side, although I'm grateful that my father didn't necessarily hold this particular view, there was a spiritualization and a hiding of children in terms of developmental differences. Needless to say, as a mother, between both of those cultures, there was still a lot of grief that occurred, because of course, when you are having a baby, the last thing you think of is your child having any kind of developmental difference that would impact the dreams and the hopes that you have for them. So one thing I do encourage people to realize is that that diagnosis brings a lot of strong emotions. And just like people grieve for someone who they may have lost in death, we may grieve for our children and go through all of those phases of grief: shock and denial, pain and guilt, anger and bargaining, the upward turn, reconstruction, and then lastly, get into a place of acceptance and hope. But what is different for us is that grief can be cyclical. So we can go through kind of that initial big cycle of grief, but then there may be times that we may be feeling that we're making progress, and there are times that we're stagnant. And so things like family outings or yearly checkups, having to explain the diagnosis to other family members and friends, can kind of trigger cycles of grief. And I also want to comment on the difference that I have noticed as not only as a pediatrician, but just as a woman between women and men. And this, I don't want this to be a general statement, but it's been a common diagnosis that we do have very different grieving styles. You know, a lot of times mothers will take this diagnosis, they're grieving, but they're trying to move forward and do a lot to kind of support the child. Men may sometimes need this period to really digest and may be in kind of anger and denial and bargaining for a lot longer. So if there's not a lot of dialogue happening around acceptance and understanding grief and how it looks in each party, it can really be a major source of stress for the family. So those that are around the family, attempting to support the family, it's really important to understand this and know this. I think also too, and I mentioned this, is that when you start this parenting journey, it isn't something that any of us is prepared to take, right? And so oftentimes the autism journey is really defined by surviving and not thriving. And there are a lot of things that we encounter on that survival road. There's fear, there's embarrassment, there's stress, there's a lot of unpredictability, and there's just a lot of unknown. And so it raises a lot of stress. And in addition to that, you know, you are still kind of battling all of those emotions, but you still have to continue to care for your child and maybe your other children, if there are other children that are present. And those behaviors that sometimes you're attempting to support can be severe, they can be unpredictable. And so they can make even just a routine task of life seem very monumental. Divorce and separation rates can be higher for families of children and youth with autism. And I never want to exclude siblings and other extended family members who are there and attempting to support, because sometimes they can mean additional familial responsibility for them. I also want to mention the importance of recognizing red flags in parents, because sometimes we are taught to look at the red flags in children, but there are parents that can truly get so paralyzed by this that they may feel like they want to hurt themselves or others. And if you're operating in a space where your child may be having very extreme behaviors, you're not getting enough rest, you know, you can make very poor choices. And I often will tell people, if they hear of things in the news where a parent may have harmed a child because of such as I said, oftentimes I really don't think they were bad parents, but they were just parents who made bad choices because of the lack of support and the high levels of stress that they were under. All right. So in terms of, you know, the emotional health and well-being of families, I think as a community, we have to really start there and understand what we are coming into this journey with. Melissa cited some studies. I don't have the exact citing for this particular study, but as a part of a support group years ago, there was a research study that showed that mothers of children with autism function or navigate their world with as much stress as soldiers in full combat. And so you can imagine if soldiers in full combat come back with all sorts of things like post-traumatic disorder, we're doing this every single day. And so we have to recognize that there's a lot that we're combating, but if we don't have those buffers to help deal with that, it's going to be challenged. So this really allows for us to be able to see the opportunity to normalize mental health, to have those discussions, and to recognize that for parents and caregivers, anxiety and depression are really probably one of the two most common mental health conditions that children and parents and children and youth with different abilities face. So family support and the importance of family support. Why is it so important? Why is it so important to have a community that cares, a community that understands? It's important because it creates hope. And I can't say that word enough. Hope is probably my favorite word in the entire English vocabulary. Hope leads to a shift in perspective. And if you notice here that, you know, I have a road symbolizing the road of thriving. Well, the same things are still on that road, right? There's still fear, there's still embarrassment, there's still stress, there's still unpredictability, there's still the unknown. But it's just that, you know what, I can navigate that. a little bit better because I have the support of others. So really what I hope to do in my lifetime and to collaborate with others who have that same mindset is to change the narrative, change the perspective around how we travel with autism, and to understand that in order for us to have lives that really are on this road to thriving, that we have to create a vision for our lives and that of our children. I want to be clear about what thriving is not, because thriving is not perpetual bliss. It isn't problem-free living. It isn't having all of the answers or solutions. No one has that. And it certainly isn't smooth sailing. But what it is that it is resilience. It's being able to develop resilience, because that really is the most reliable and sustainable fuel for our journeys, whether you have a child with autism or not. And we build resilience by really securing those opportunities to build greater and more sustained hope, health, and happiness on our journey. So I often will share that I think it's important to start with the end in mind, right? I think at the end of all of our lives, we have to answer two questions. The first is, one, did we love well? And the second is, did we live fully? And loving and living requires that we have, one, loving that you have those connections, right? And you are able to build relationships. Living means that you have to have experiences, either with people or without people. But really, those are the things we want to look at when we think about, what does life look like for all of us? What does a quality life look like? When we're thinking about becoming holistic parent advocates or supporting those around us who are trying to do this, we have to think about what are the opportunities that they can secure. And when I further define it, it means that that family and that child has to be experiencing at least some level of consistent emotional and physical well-being. They really need to be able to have the tools and the ability to navigate, whether it's education or vocation. They also need to be able to be represented. So to be able to be a part or have their voice if they choose to in, their community, be enriched and be involved in their community. And if they can and want to be able to participate in research. And when I say research, I know research for communities of color can really raise a lot of red flags, but we have amazing researchers of color. Dr. Duchene Kelly is one of them. And we want to be able to have our voices heard in ethical, moral research that really changes, the trajectory of our children's lives. So when I talk about research, this is also a very important part for us. But if we're just kind of boiling things down to two things, at least we want to be able to have parents to have, well-being and to be able to successfully navigate their child's education and vocation. All right, so this is a very busy slide, but I want to talk about barriers to achieving this holistic advocacy, because if you look at this slide, you'll see that becoming a holistic advocate is at the top of a staircase, right? We don't get from diagnosis to holistic self-advocacy. There are certain steps that we need to be able to take. And at each of those steps, there are barriers, but every barrier can also be turned into an opportunity for us. So starting with identification, it's really critical that our children get identified, because you cannot support what you have not been able to identify. Some of the barriers our children of color face are a lot of bias when it comes to the diagnosis. Sometimes the typical presentation or the presentation that is kind of shown in society about children and youth with autism is that kind of young Sheldon presentation, but children of color may present very differently. Girls of color are often very much overlooked because of the way that they present. So implicit bias is really huge. Some of the social determinants of health. So we know that people of the African diaspora really are impacted by social determinants of health at a far greater rate than their white or non-Black counterparts. Long wait times. Again, we just don't have a lot of diagnosticians, and we don't have a lot of diagnosticians of color. And then really also the importance of not only just getting a diagnosis of autism, but really being able to have people from other disciplines evaluate our children to understand and give a complete picture of what's happening. A lot of times what happens is that we have to, as families, you have to keep retelling that story, and sometimes it can be traumatizing. When we move to that second step after identification, we think of acceptance. And I think acceptance, I've kind of touched on it, is an area that is a huge struggle for many different cultures, but I can speak really to just the African diaspora and some of our challenges. So as I mentioned before, there can be a dismissal of the diagnosis. There can be hiding of children with the diagnosis. I'll share very quickly, to try and mask names, but I had a family from Nigeria who sought me out for a diagnostic evaluation. And if anybody knows anything about West African culture, your firstborn son that's the king, right? And so it was their firstborn son. And so I do my visits over 3 parts. And when we got to that second part, it was clear that this child was showing signs and symptoms of autism. And, the parent asked me, what do I think? And so I shared, well, I'll be able to give a full picture at the 3rd visit, but I am seeing some signs. Well, just that one comment led to that family making multiple calls to our office the next day. And by the time I got around to them, they asked that I should burn the charts. I should not share any of that information, not even to the child's pediatrician who referred them. And the hard part about this particular evaluation was that they also had a younger child who came to their older brother's evaluation, and it was very clear that she too was on the spectrum. So it was a huge dilemma for me to say, okay, how can I even get past this big wall of acceptance in this child and then begin to even share and break the news of what I'm seeing in the younger child? Well, to make a long story short, the family came back years later. I thought I'd never see them again, but they came back years later, about 2-3 years later, for the daughter. And they admitted that they were in denial about what was happening with the daughter, but they were willing and to understand and to get the help she needed because she was presenting pretty profoundly. And when I inquired about that older son, there was still a barrier to accepting. They would not use the term, they would not have any part of that. So that's just a really strong example of acceptance, but culture plays a huge role. Our gender differences play a huge role, our caregiving roles, and just stigma that we feel in our community and society around developmental differences. I often say developmental disabilities are really the last frontier of civil rights. Creating vision, so that's the next step. And this to me is really the missing piece for everything. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about creating vision and then how we seek out supports and services. All right, but what are some things as a community that you can do in order to help in terms of acceptance, fostering acceptance? Encourage parents to take time for themselves and their relationships. Encourage parents within your circle to join a support group. That's huge. We heard about what the support group did for one of the moms that Dr. Kelly shared. Encourage parents to celebrate their children. And again, I keep harping on this vision, but it's so important. And encourage families to connect with their faith-based communities. Our faith-based communities can be very strong for those of us of the diaspora. Sometimes they can be places that we can, realize a lot of hurt too, but to keep searching. Also, it's really important for us as a community, a broader community, to remember that a child is not autism, but they're a person first, and they have autism. We also have a shift in how people want to see themselves. We have the voices of a lot of self-advocates who are comfortable with saying, I am an autistic man, woman, whatever. So just be sensitive to that. It's very important to understand that children are not static, that every child's mind is capable of learning, and our children will often surprise us with the progress they make. I can truly say this now that my children are adults. There were things, just starting with my youngest, my first child to be diagnosed. She went from saying a lot to being nonverbal for 6 years. And now I cannot get her to stop talking. It's like she talks nonstop. Where I have my youngest son, still, communication is profoundly affected with him. But I've seen growth and changes in him in terms of his ability to self-care and him trying to find his voice, even at the age of 20. So that's really important that we remember that children will surprise us. All children will make gains. It's also important to expect more and give children a chance to show you what they're capable of doing. Don't just make assumptions just because a person has autism that they can't do. And then last but not least, avoid comparing children to others. This is for any caregiver that's on the call. This is truly a recipe for lifelong depression and stress. And for those of you who are supporting families, you will be contributing to lifelong depression and stress if you constantly compare your loved one to other children. So please do your best to avoid this. All right, so we're going to touch on creating a good life. And this is a tool from a framework called Charting the Life course. But creating a vision is huge. And we have to look at vision across the lifespan, right? Because when we have vision, we have something to move towards. So I just shared this. This is a tool that can be used. It's important for parents to think and to dream for their children. And even if they're not able to do it, all the way to adulthood, even giving them the opportunity to say, listen, a year from now, what do you want to see happen? What would mean a good life for you as a mom, as a dad, as a family? And what does a good life look like for your son? Maybe you just want to see your child use 5 or 6 more words. That's a change. So being able to identify that and to create vision, craft vision is huge because you now have something to work towards. And then once you're able to share this vision, create the vision, it's important to make sure that you're sharing it with everyone that interacts with your child, because you want as many lenses on that child as possible. So of course, family members, a pediatrician, any kind of specialist, definitely your school-based team, have everyone understand that, yes, you have high hopes and expectations for your children. And all studies show that when parents have expectations for their children and youth, these children go on, adult studies show that they go on to do much better than parents who are never able to set expectations and have hopes for their children. All right. Once you have vision, then that's the time to start thinking about services and supports. What are the supports and services that you need? And this 3-bucket framework also comes from something called Charting the Life course. You have to sit back and ask yourself, well, what are my needs? Do I need to connect and network? So that's talking to someone who's been there. That could be like a support group. Maybe I need to get more education. Maybe I need to, discover and navigate this diagnosis a little bit more, learn more about autism, or learn more about some of the coexisting conditions that go along with it, like maybe communication delays or some of the emotional behavioral health concerns that go along with it. So that's getting information, getting education, getting training. And then the other bucket would be, well, what are some of the day-to-day things and supports that I may need? Like, what are some of the medical interventions that I may need? What are some of the educational supports that I may need? Maybe I need financial supports. So looking at that vision and trying to examine supports and services in the light of these buckets can help us be more focused and strategic, and really having family members who can help you with this process can really be helpful, because sometimes there are things that they're seeing that you can come somewhat as a parent become blind to, or you get used to doing for your child. All right, other things to just keep in mind is that help parents to kind of think about supports and services. I will say that there are 4 things that people need to consider. Does a therapy pose any threat to their child's physical or psychological well-being? I mentioned this because, autism is one of these developmental differences that sometimes people have a lot of desperation, and you can have people preying on others. And when I say preying, not the good kind of preying. And so you want to be able to bounce ideas and thoughts off of people that you trust. Asking also, how much time will it take to employ an intervention? And is that time practical for the child or for the family? You may get a ton of recommendations. I tell families all the time, I can give you a lot of recommendations, but you really have to sit back and ask yourself, if I'm going to be running around 7 days a week trying to get supports and I'm no use to myself or to my child because I'm so exhausted, is it really worth it? No, yeah, you want to be available to your child in a wholesome way. How much will it cost? So are you going to become financially handicapped or broke or unable to meet essential household needs? So just being able to help that guide like your choice of services and maybe some things that you can look into. And then also asking, is this something that has some evidence behind it or not? It doesn't mean that everything that doesn't have evidence behind it may not be helpful, but you also want to be careful about things that may not be. All right. And no matter what you choose, whether it's supports, services, always encourage evaluation of it. It's important to ask, is this making a difference? And that's where vision becomes flexible, because you can always change that vision based on what you're seeing, right? And it helps you to make and decide whether or not your time and your funds should be invested. In closing, I would say that the ultimate outcome for all of us, whether we're an individual with autism, neurodiverse, or we're a family member, or we're a community supporting that person, really needs to be measured in an improvement in the quality of life and function of the individual with autism, but also their family. We cannot separate one from the other. And so we have many individuals with autism impacting the world in a very powerful way. We want to just open up the horizons to what they're capable of doing. And I want to thank you. And I'm going to close on two quotes. I'm definitely a quote junkie, but there are two that I thought are just really nice for any of the parents or caregivers or those that are supporting them. First is, parenthood is about raising and celebrating the child you have, not the child you thought you had. It's about understanding your child is exactly the person they are supposed to be. And if you're lucky, they might be the teacher who turned you into the person you're supposed to be. And that's from The Water Giver. And the last one is, while we try to teach our children all about life, our children teach us what life is all about. And that's from Angela Schwinn. So thank you. And I hope that what I was able to share resonates.
Awesome. Thank you both to Dr. Duchene Kelly and Dr. Tazanu for that great and informative presentation, for those great and informative presentations on autism. There are a lot of questions coming in Q&A box. So I encourage our audience, please begin adding your questions to the Q&A so that we can really gain from the wealth of knowledge that our two presenters have. And I am going to get us started. But first, of course, please thanks to our presenters. So feel free to share your thanks in the chat and to add your questions to the Q&A box. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to ask both presenters to please come on camera.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So the first question I'm going to ask, the question is, what is happening that autism is on the rise? Is there a way of prevention?
Well, autism is not. So here's the thing. We have to consider whether more people actually have autism, or is it that more people are aware of the symptoms and they're going to now to go get their child diagnosed. So those, we have to consider both of those. And we don't necessarily know. As a researcher, I think that more and more evidence is coming out that yes, if a child is, let's say, socially awkward, or if they're exhibiting behaviors like spinning or fidgeting a lot, maybe it would behoove the parent to just go, because it's not going to harm, it can only help, right? To go get your child assessed to determine whether or not they are on the spectrum. But in terms of can it be prevented, there's no way to determine. There's no blood test. It affects multiple regions of the brain. So I wish I could, as a researcher, I'd be rich if I could say it's this part of the brain, right? I'd be famous and I'd be rich, and I could solve that issue, that public health issue. But because it's so multifaceted, it's really difficult to determine whether or not a person is going to have autism based off of their genes. Although there is a genetic component to it. For example, if a parent has one child who's on the spectrum, it increases the likelihood that they'll have another child. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will have another child that's on the spectrum. It just increases it. Also, it could be some environmental factors. For example, pollutants in the air. There's some regions of the US where there's more of a higher concentration of individuals who are on the spectrum as compared to other regions. So it's more of a gene by environment kind of effect that's going on here.
Yeah, I actually very much agree. In terms of prevalence, so I will say when I was in residency, which was over 20 something years ago, I was taught 1 in 1,000 children was on the autism spectrum. And now we fast forward today and we have 1 in 36. So I do believe it's a combination of better identification, and a lot of those individuals who were diagnosed maybe with, the term is now been put to rest, mental retardation, it's now called intellectual disability, were probably individuals who also had autism as well. But I do believe that, as Melissa said, there can be some genetic influences and environmental things. We just don't know, because the identification rate is kind of skyrocketing, or the prevalence is skyrocketing faster than our ability to do the research and to understand. Definitely, there is a higher risk if for another child to have autism, but even those numbers are kind of questionable based on the research. Sometimes they'll say 5%, sometimes up to 30%. We do know that you can have siblings, however, who do have other emotional behavioral health challenges, some like ADHD or anxiety, can be higher in siblings. But yes, there is no autism test. There's no genetic in utero tests that we can say, yes, this child will have it. No.
Okay. Along the lines, there was another question that you kind of spoke to with environmental pollutants. They were also wondering about food allergies, chemicals. Have you all found, is there any literature, medical literature, about potential root causes of its development, particularly related to food allergies or chemical impacts? Has there been any research on that?
I think there's been a lot of research, but the research is so different, and the source of the research can be very different. Sources of research can be very different. So you can have, people all the way from NIH to people who may embrace more what we call biomedical integrative type medicine research. And so you have varying results. I would say, and this may just be more of a personal opinion, so I'll preface it by saying that, I really feel that the food industry in this country is very much impacted by capitalism. And so there's a lot that, that is pushed on children, whether they're have developmental issues or not, that it's not really healthy. A lot of our children's diets are not healthy. If you look at foods that are typically marketed to children, they're usually foods with very high levels of sugar, a lot of artificial colorants, a lot of chemicals. So we as a community, especially as a community of color, when we deal with a lot of food deserts and places where we cannot get quality foods, it really behooves us to really understand what we're putting in our bodies. So I what goes in does come out. Now, does it mean that it's causative of autism? No, I can't clearly say that, but I can say that I do believe that, we are seeing the impact of diet on other things. We do see higher rates of allergies and asthma at one point, which were going down, are now coming back up again. But I do feel it's important to try your best to have as healthy as a diet. I also know that, from a medical standpoint, African Americans do struggle with or people of African descent are more challenged when it comes to dairy input. So we tend to have more lactose intolerance. And again, that's another industry that's very much pushed in in our kind of capitalistic society. But I do share people, the only person that needs milk is a baby cow. So if you really enjoy milk, then that's great and it has no problems, but there's no real reason why anyone should be drinking milk after, especially non-human breast milk after a certain age. So I think it just behooves us to kind of read labels and make the healthiest, best choices that we can for our children. Is any of it causative? I can't say I've seen and come across any research to say, yes, this is the definitive cause. I think there's so many factors that can be contributed into it.
So along those lines, there was a question about food, and the attendee asked what holistic herbs and foods can help them, and what food, are there any foods that should be avoided? So again, I think you just shared that it hasn't been any research on that, but I guess anecdotally speaking, would you have a comment to them about how they're feeding their children?
Yes, I would say there hasn't been research. I'm just not aware of all the research. So let me make sure that I'm clear about that point. In terms of how you're feeding your children, just do your best to avail yourself of healthy food choices. So I always say if you pick up a box and it looks like whatever's on that box should have 5 ingredients and you come across 20 ingredients, 15 of which you cannot pronounce, it's probably not the healthiest food choice for you. You probably need to put that back. So just think about things and avail yourself of knowledge of artificial colorants and some of the names and terms that they may come under. A lot of sugar, read your labels and understand what are the ranges that children should have in terms of that. So making good, healthy choices. And we do know that a lot of children with autism, even without autism, can be very selective when it comes to food. Some of that has to do with their sensory challenges. Some of that has to do with just the restrictive, repetitive nature of their brains. So if you have children who are challenged in that area, you want to make sure that if you can get a good quality multivitamin in them. I think vitamin D is very, very important for people of color to take. Remember, our melanin, we already have been displaced from our kind of natural homeland, which we had a lot of sun. We're in places where we don't get a lot of sun, and vitamin D is more for than bones. It's really important for immune function and cancer prevention. So get vitamin D levels checked and make sure that you're supplementing with vitamin D. That goes for everyone, not just children on the spectrum. Fish oils are also very helpful. Probiotics are also very helpful, but they're helpful for everyone. So that's my piece of advice.
Thank you for that very informative and very thorough answer. And like you said, that applies to all of us. So thank you for sharing that. The next question from Robert, he asked, is the presence of fathers significant? So Dr. Duchene Kelly, can you maybe speak to, I know your research focuses on mothers, but can you speak to the impact of autism on fathers and fathers raising children?
Right. I obviously a lot of my research is on mothers, but I'm actually veering into including fathers because we all know fathers matter. Whether you have a child who's on the spectrum, or whether you have a typically neurodevelopmental child, it matters. So I would say yes, 100%. Having a father in the household, or even if he's out of the household, but just having a good presence, a strong presence in a child's life is impactful.
Yes, definitely, Melissa, I would agree. And in terms of just the work, what I find is that when it comes to getting diagnostic evaluations and seeking out services, I mean, unfortunately, 9 times out of 10, it's the moms that are doing a lot of this work. And we really celebrate when we see dads come in and they're very active and involved. But in some of our fathers' defenses, I think too, this is a very difficult conversation to have for men. Women, we tend to open up and we share a lot easier. So it's really being able to provide safe spaces for men to be able to connect with each other around these things and how they grieve. We've had the blessing of having a father of a young man with autism kind of run a support group, and it's been really helpful. Some of the things he shared about dads and the acceptance, because it's a very different picture, but that that dialogue needs to happen. We really need to find ways to engage our fathers. The other thing is that our children's responses to the different genders are also different, but equally important. There are things that sometimes children may get used to moms saying, but dads may say it in a different way, and they have a better impact. So yeah, as much as we can encourage dads to be present, their presence is powerful. Yeah.
Agreed. And I thank that person for writing that question, because it actually, it's propelling me forward to make sure that I include fathers in my research, because we all know fathers matter. And there's so little research out there on Black fathers parenting children who are on the spectrum.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that. The next question, I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions from Zahn and Terry. And they're asking about the role of vaccines in autism. So do you think, or is there any research that show the increase in autism being related to the increased childhood vaccine schedule?
That's a question I get asked often from my students. And I actually was going to interject and include a comment about that when we were discussing foods, but I didn't want to open up Pandora's box. But here it is. Here's the question. So the answer to that, based off of research, is no. There is no connection between vaccines and autism. Oftentimes people think that, but as a researcher, as a scientist, I go by that, and there's no connection. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, has said that, has printed that time and time again.
And I would say too, so this is from a mother and a pediatrician standpoint. So I don't discount parents who made a direct connection. So but I will say this, there have been a handful of parents that said, I saw an actual change right at the time of this particular vaccine. We do know that there are some vaccines that may cause neurological, but they're usually pretty rare. That being said, though, I am always sensitive to, a parent's desire to either, not vaccine, or encourage them if they want, they are leery, to take a slower approach to vaccination of their children. Like I know with myself, when my daughter had the diagnosis and I was, the youngest, the baby was born, I was very concerned about that. There was so much I was reading and trying to process. So I actually waited. I said, let me just wait this out. And, but he still ended up showing signs and symptoms of autism. So I'm just sensitive to that. So I don't discount those parents who say, I can, he had it today and the next day this was some, because we have seen some rare things like that. But I don't think there's any research, or the research that may show it, there have been some flaws with it. So.
Right. I think anecdotally speaking, meaning that if it was your personal experience, or you have a family or a friend who's experienced that, and they can, or they made the connection between the vaccine and the autism, that's one thing. But to say with conviction, say with your chest, that is the vaccine that caused my child to have autism, the research does not support that.
Exactly.
Thank you. Todd asked, for both presenters, in the Black community, why is there more of a stigma as it pertains to ASD? I guess the assumption being that there is more of a stigma, but so is there more of a stigma? We can start there based upon your research, what you've experienced. And if so, why is there more of a stigma, or even why is there a stigma in the Black community with ASD?
I think that there's, just my personal opinion, I feel like the Black community is less accepting of anything that is other. So anything that deviates from the norm, we're less accepting of it, whether it's disorders, mental health issues, neurological disorders, physical disabilities. I think that oftentimes the Black community decides collectively that it's something that they're not willing to support necessarily. But Abila, help me out here. Do you feel like there's
So what I see, I think because we're a community that's already stigmatized just because we're Black, that this history of discrimination and racism, it's like anything that adds another variable to creating disadvantage is shunned. I mean, it's, you know, you're already struggling just to be accepted or to be in circles, and then you have this additional thing that may cause you to be rejected. So I think that's what I think. Also, there's also this knowledge, just information, being able to share information about what does good, what does child development look like. I think the other thing we have to think of too, and Melissa, you probably have done more, like, is the role of trauma in our communities, and, anything that made us stand out, in the past could have gotten us killed. So, or was, grounds for, very punitive measures. So I think a lot of this is something that has just been embedded from years and years of Western brutalization. That's the best way I can describe it, is of people. So, there's a lot that we have to do to kind of reverse that psychology, and a lot of self-love and self-acceptance that has to be developed amongst us as a people, because we even reject ourselves even on a spectrum of different ways, whether that's through colorism or economic statuses. So I think just adding another thing to the soup just makes it hard for us to.
Right. And I think that we're afraid of being labeled or put in the
exactly.
box. That's what it is. Yeah, being labeled, because then once you have this label, then people may interact with you differently. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's this fear.
Yeah. And I've also add the point about labels, because I know it's such a touchy subject in our community, right? Because you have one voice or one camp saying, don't let people give your child a label. Yet on the other hand, so I'm a proponent of identifying what's going on with your child, right? Because, either way, a child that is having any kind of developmental or behavioral difference is going to get a label. Let's give that child a label that's going to help and support them, right? So if they're going to not get the diagnosis, guess what? They're going to get a label of they're just a troublemaker, they're the bad kid, they're the, the delinquent. And what these labels do is lead to that school to prison pipeline that we see so many of our young men going down. If we're able to get a label that we can now use to advocate for services and supports, let's do that. Now, does that mean you just slap labels across everybody, just, whitewash everybody? No. And this calls for us being able to do quality evaluations and have our children evaluated by people that look like them, so that we're having impactful evaluations. But I do believe a label is important in order to advocate for your children. I've just seen it with my own children and how that's been huge in terms of helping. So,
right.
Awesome. So along those lines of helping, Zahn asked, do you recommend any support groups, or can you point us in the right direction to find one?
Yeah. I think there's lots of Facebook groups. There are virtual platforms, like our entity has a mother support group. We call it Mamas, Mothering Authentically, Mindfully, and Aware of Self. I just think it's important to look, because the landscape of family support has changed. Like when my daughter was first coming up, a lot of these things weren't really out there, and so that's why I kind of went down this track. But now there's so much that's out there, and I think this is one of the benefits of social media. So it's just important to reach out and see what's there. So you can look at like your Autism Speaks website, your Autism Society of America, and a lot of times they'll have resources and lists of different support groups. But get connected. It is so important to be with other parents who understand your journey, so you don't feel isolated, you don't feel alone.
Okay, and along those lines, AJ adds, what resources are available internationally, especially in the Caribbean or on a continent, for parents?
That's a good one. I know there are a couple of I think they refer to them as NGOs, which is the same thing as a nonprofit here in Africa. But on the continent, there are few countries that really have, I would say, coordinated support. I think Ethiopia is one nation that may have it. Rwanda may be another nation, but there's a lot of the service are either non-existent or fragmented. And so there's a huge need for that. In the Caribbean, I think, again, it's island dependent. I can only speak for like Trinidad. I think I remember meeting a developmental pediatrician there who's trying to kind of rally up some supports. But there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in our African and African diasporic nations around this. So, Melissa, I don't know if you know anything different.
No, I don't. Unfortunately, I kind of know. I know the community, the surrounding in which I reside, right? Because I'm really an advocate for those who are on the spectrum here in this community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So a really good question from Andrea. She asked, if there isn't a test, how is autism diagnosed? Can you help our audience understand how one is given that diagnosis?
Mm-hmm. So it's all about behavior, right? Behavior that the person who's diagnosing sees when they're interacting with the child, but also reports from parents. And even it could be reports from the teacher and reports from the pediatrician. So it's all about, what do you see this child doing? And Abila, I know you diagnose children day in and day out. So what do you look for specifically?
Yeah, so I always tell parents that I think the diagnostic process for autism is more of an art than a science, because you have many different people that can perform that diagnosis. So you can have, I'm a general pediatrician, but I no longer practice general peds because the population I support is children with youth. But you can have developmental pediatrics, psychology, nurse practitioner, psychiatrist. When it comes to what someone should look for in terms of the diagnostic process, you always want to have a really good developmental history taken. You want to have a good medical history taken, because there may be some other conditions that may mimic. You want to also, I encourage the use of some kind of parent rating scale, because this allows the parent's voice to be heard when it comes to what are some of the signs and symptomology associated with autism. And then it's very, very important to have observation. So as Dr. Duchene was saying, you have to spend time observing this child. You have to look at their ability to socialize and create relationships. How are they engaging others? How are they responding to the engagement of others? What are they doing around communication? Are they using functional communication? And if they are using functional communication, how is that being used to help them socialize and navigate their day-to-day world and to create connections? And then you're looking for the presence of restrictive and repetitive behaviors. Sometimes it may be mild, so it may look like little quirks, and sometimes it may be more profound where it's very obvious. So it really, it takes time to do a good evaluation, and all of those components should be done. I also think it's very important to at least screen for or to identify the concern for other coexisting conditions, because we often don't see autism by itself. You know, oftentimes there may be concerns around attentional concerns, anxiety, sometimes, you know, OCD. So we want to make sure, depending on the child's age and how they're presenting, that we're providing as robust of a picture of this child, because that's going to be what decides the types of supports and recommendations are needed.
Right, just a quick recap. Those 3 hallmark signs that clinicians, pediatricians are looking for are social interactions. Are they awkward or not? Communication, any deficits in their ability to communicate, and restrictive or repetitive behavior. Do they really focus on one schedule? If you deviate from that schedule, are they going to have difficulty with that? Do you have any type of repetitive behavior? Let's say turning around in circles, flapping their hands, fidgeting often, but doing it time and time and time again. So those 3 things are critical.
Yeah. And again, keep in mind that the presentation among the genders look very different. We're now learning that, we probably have more girls that have this diagnosis, but they don't present necessarily, unless maybe more profoundly affected with a lot of the restrictive repetitive behaviors that males do. And so they can do a lot of what they call masking of their symptoms. And so it takes a lot of time to kind of sort that out. And sometimes you're getting a lot of self-reports. I, of late, have had older teens and young adults come in because, there's more out there they're reading and they're questioning whether or not this diagnosis may be in them.
So along those lines, AJ asked, boys are more impacted than girls, and he wants to know, is this true across race?
Yes. And also we see that also for other developmental disabilities, so just not autism, we tend to have more male presentations for certain conditions than girls.
Remember the research, there's some research that's out there that suggests that it's possibly because of that extra X chromosome. It serves as a protective factor for these girls, whereas the boys don't have that extra X chromosome.
Yeah.
Okay. The next several questions are around education, and I'm going to, I was going to try to combine them. I'm just going to ask them separately. So the first one is, what should be on a child's IEP to make sure they're getting the assistance that they need?
Do you want me to take that?
Yes.
So that's a big question. That's probably a whole other presentation in and of itself. But I will say this. The first thing is that you need to have autism identified on the IEP, because when children are younger, oftentimes they may qualify for an IEP, but what we see, especially in, well, I'll speak to Prince George's County, and we may see it in other counties, is that we have children that will be in the educational system under the Code of Developmental Disability. And then when they are 8 or 9 by law, federal law, that has to be changed. You cannot carry that code. And so then we tend to get this explosion of autism on IEPs at 8 to 9. But as early as possible, if you have a diagnosis of autism, you want to advocate for that to be on the IEP. And then the simplest way that I can tell you to kind of look for what should be on there is look at those core characteristics of autism that Dr. Kelly just went over. So social interactions, there should be ways to support social emotional growth and development and interaction. So, and then look at communication. Does your child have challenges with communication? There can be challenges with functional communication, just having speech, or maybe what we call pragmatic communication. How are they using speech? So does the IEP identify that? And are there goals and supports to help with that? That last area, behaviors, can be supported in many different ways, but the most accountable way to have anything supported on the IEP is to have a written goal for that particular concern and objectives to meet that, because that's how progress is measured. If you just have a bunch of accommodations and modifications, you cannot measure those. All the measurement of that is going to be subjective based on who's looking at your child. But having goals and objectives, and you clearly understanding, well, what does it look like if my child meets this goal? Help me understand. Once you're clear about that, then you are able to kind of give input and help that team understand whether or not that child is meeting that goal from your perspective. The most important thing I will also say is that you are a member of that team. You can call an IEP meeting at any time. It doesn't have to be an annual event. You can call it for any concern, and you should. And so those parents that are actively involved, even if they may not understand everything about the IEP process, but they are voicing their concerns, those children tend to get more supports put into their educational plans than if a parent may not understand or isn't there. The other thing are services. So additional services like speech or OT or behavioral support. So those are all things that can be placed into the IEP. Now, school teams may decide how they provide that, that you can have what we call consultative supports, where somebody just comes in and advises the teacher, or you can have direct services. which are given to the child specifically in a one-on-one setting or maybe in a group setting. So as a team, you need to kind of understand and decide how, in what way your child needs to be supported, or if they need these additional services. Not every child with autism is going to need exactly the same service. It's going to really depend on how that child is presenting. But at least ask yourself the question, am I touching socialization? Am I touching communication? Am I addressing behaviors?
Great. And along those lines, let's see, it was Zahn who asked, can you share your opinion on the best or better suited school environment or curriculum for autistic children, for example, Montessori versus public school? Although Montessori can be public school, so I guess more sort of a Montessori classroom versus a more traditional classroom.
I have an opinion, but I'm going to defer to, because Dr. Kelly's in education.
It depends on the child, because again, autism is a spectrum. So you have from low functioning all the way to advanced high functioning. So I think it really depends on the child. Think of it as like a child who's just typically developing. Some may gravitate based off of their learning style or their behavior, may gravitate more towards Montessori school, whereas some may be quite fine in a public school or a private school. So it really depends.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I would strongly agree. It really depends on the child and the child's need. There's
Great.
no one cookie cutter setting.
Right.
Yes, and the last few questions that I'm going to ask are kind of related to, some of these might kind of fall in that category where it depends on where a child may fall on the spectrum, but a couple of attendees would like to know if you are, let's say, a relative or an instructor with children or students who have autism, what are some recommendations for ways to communicate with them in the short periods of time that they interact with that child? So one is like a grandparent who FaceTimes her grandchild, and wants to know what's the best way to communicate in that short time span, whereas another is a martial arts instructor and who may have autistic students. Do you have any recommendations for their interactions or the best ways to support, I guess, the language or any dynamic that the child may have?
Yeah, I think, Abila, this would be a good question for you as part of your presentation.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to what I mentioned. Is the first is presuming competence, right? Just approach it like you would any other child, and then give that child an opportunity to show you who they are and what you may need to do differently. So if you start a conversation and you get the sense that maybe that child isn't quite understanding, you may need to either kind of break it down a little bit more, or if you get the understanding, wow, this child is way above what I thought, you can kind of elevate, the complexity of how you're trying to communicate. But be patient. I mean, just be patient. Allow that child to show you who they are, not just even what they can do, but even their interests, the things that because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, right? They may have an interest that you can kind of build off of and kind of run with and introduce new concepts around. So I think it's about presuming competence and allowing that child to kind of guide you and not being afraid. I think sometimes fear prevents a lot of people from even engaging or attempting to engage in the first place. Kids with autism don't bite. They're not gonna, well, I'll take that back. Some may bite in there, and then the setting that may not be, but they're just not gonna haul off in the time you have the conversation. And I think sometimes these are the misconceptions that people sometimes have. I remember when my youngest was having a lot of health issues, and he's a tall kid and a big kid, and we went to the hospital, and everyone that we went to, they were like, oh, he has autism. Is he aggressive? Is he aggressive? That was the first question they kept asking me. I'm like, this is the gentlest kid you're going to come across. You're not going to have any problems doing any of his, his procedures. And so said, so done. So it's just, give that child, I know we have to ask questions, but give that child or that person the opportunity to show you who they are. Don't just make assumptions about what they are. Because usually what we kind of internalize about autism are based on experiences that we've had. And sometimes those experiences may not have been very positive. So we apply that with a broad brush across everyone. So
Right. I couldn't agree more, Abila, with what you're saying. Just as a professor at Bowie State University, I come across students who I suspect is on the spectrum. I don't know because they don't disclose that information, but based off of the hallmark signs, I do suspect they're on the spectrum, but I treat them just like any other student. Sometimes I may have to repeat myself more often for clarity purposes, but they're still, I have to repeat myself for other students.
yeah, exactly.
So I treat them exactly the same.
Exactly.
And then a follow-up question, in terms of diagnosing someone with autism, about how long does it take to confirm that a child is autistic? Someone would like to know.
So I guess are you talking about the age at which you can make a diagnosis, or like the actual process of the diagnosis?
Probably the process.
Evaluation. Oh, okay. So again, I think that that varies across professionals, and what tools they may be using. I can only speak to like my process, and the process we use is a 3-part visit. And so typically the first visit, we're getting a pretty comprehensive general medical history as well as the developmental history. We are also having the parent complete an autism spectrum rating scales and some other emotional behavioral health screeners. The second visit is where we do that observation. We do almost everything virtually, which that was actually one of the blessings of COVID. We were able to see kids in their natural environment without them having to make transitions, which sometimes led to behaviors. And then spending that time to do the observation. The third visit is where we take all of that information and then help a parent to understand, is autism present? And here are some other things that you may want to support, and then recommendations about other things that they should do, like maybe getting the genetic blood work, getting certain evaluations and referrals from other specialists. So every professional may have a different spin to how that's done. I think it's not so much how much time, but the robustness of the evaluation. If you walk into an evaluation and 15 minutes later they tell you the child has autism, if they're a seasoned person and they've had a lot of experience, that may be the case. But I think it does a parent disservice if they don't quite understand how you got to that diagnosis. So if you kind of think about those kind of components that we shared earlier, that may help.
Thank you. And for our final question for the evening, it's a combination question, but I think it's a great way to kind of bring all of this together. And we're talking about children who happen to have autism. And the questions are around how to best support them as they interact overall within the family. So with other siblings. The question speaks particularly to siblings, but feel free to expand that to supporting a child with autism as they interact with siblings, cousins, other relatives. What are some suggestions for how parents can make that the best experience possible? So in terms of sharing and civil rivalry, which is already a issue, with kids anyway, but particularly, I guess, if you have autism, how to approach that.
Remember, autism is a neurological disorder, so the neurons aren't firing the same way as a child who's not on the autism spectrum, but the child is a child, right? So I would say incorporate the child in playing with their siblings, playing with their cousins. Don't let that child isolate themselves or be isolated. I would say teach the child, say if they might have, be a more on the aggressive side. Teach the child about gentle hands, right? Repetition is key for children. The only way that they learn is if we teach them. So I would say that train the child or interact with the child the same way that you would do with any other child.
And I would add to that by saying, when we think of siblings, think of them as the same thing that a parent is going through when it comes to kind of acceptance and understanding of their child. Siblings are also dealing with those same emotions too. You know, they may be faced with fear and anxiety and, you know, embarrassment, but sometimes they're not given the voice to be able to talk about those things. So I think it's important to make sure that your children are just as much connected as you are, and that you can have these candid conversations and expose them to other siblings who may be going through the same thing. Education for them is huge. There is no, I would be sitting here and saying and being a full out liar if I said I've had the answer to how to make, you know, siblings with or without autism kind of understand. It's a journey. You know, I think about my two children who are not impacted. You know, I think the most important lesson I've had to tell them is that, you know, yes, your sibling has autism, but the most important, they're a part of our family. They're loved. Like, that's the most important label that any child can wear, is the fact that they're loved, you know, and that they are accepted, whether they're able to, you know, fully have the capacity to fully be involved in everything or not, just as long as that child knows that they're loved and they're accepted. But education for other family members is huge. I mean, if they're willing to accept it, because you can't force people to do anything, but I think starting there and just helping them to understand, we just want to have an environment of inclusivity and letting that child feel that they're embraced and loved no matter what.
Precisely. And I would add to that, Abila, I would say that also consider your human resources, right? With your patience level, try to be patient, not with just with the child who's on autism or not just the sibling, with both. When it comes to your time, the quality of your interaction, the time, the amount of time spent, try to make it as even as possible so that one child doesn't feel slighted.
Yeah. 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 There'll always be some mom guilt there. Yeah.
Well, awesome. Thank you. Thank you both, Dr. Duchene Kelly and Dr. Tazanu, for a wonderful, informative, and robust conversation tonight on autism. We thank you for coming out. Thank you, audience, for being so engaged in tonight's discussion and really asking some thought-provoking questions that I'm sure resonated with many people who attended this evening or who will watch this program later on. And again, if you do want to watch this program, it will be on our IKG YouTube page. So I'm going to begin to close out and invite you all out to our August 16th Wisdom Wednesday, which will feature Baba Wakesa Mazimoyo of the Aya Educational Institute. And you may also know him from Warriors, Healers, and Builders, a great presentation on holistic health and really finding a way to attune our physical, spiritual, and mental health strategies to build up mental health and dealing with this world. I'm going to also be putting in a chat some of those website links to the events that I mentioned at the beginning of the program. And I would like to ask our presenters, if you do have any way that our audience members can reach you in the future, please feel free to put your email or any contact information in the chat for them. If you have a website or organization or some way they can reach you, or any links to materials, books or periodicals that you might have written. And then also want to give you an opportunity for any final closing words that you would like to leave with us. And whoever would like to go first can take it.
I will say this. I share with everyone, I say, I think we're all on the spectrum in some way, form, or fashion, right? We all have our quirks. We all have our differences. We all may have strengths and weaknesses when it comes to the three areas that we identified as kind of those diagnostic criteria. The difference between, you know, getting a diagnosis and not is how much of a barrier is it to your everyday functioning. And so if we keep that in mind, it will help us to be more understanding, more empathetic, more embracing. And just to remember that everyone wants, the most important title that we all want is the one of being loved. So I would close that out.
Love and hope.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you. So again, thank you everyone for coming out. This concludes this evening's program. We wish you all a wonderful rest of your week and rest of the month. So we will see you all next month. Be well.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.